What if everything you thought you knew about a powerful family was a lie? What if the final words of a man who built an empire didn't unite his children, but destroyed them? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And what if a single sentence, read aloud in a quiet room, became the most brutal act of betrayal any of them would ever experience? Because on that night, when the will was finally opened, no one was prepared for what it said. Not Jake, not Romy, and certainly not Nick. Especially not Nick. The room was silent. Not the respectful kind, the suffocating kind, the kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe, the kind that comes right before everything falls apart. Picture this: a private law office in Los Angeles. Heavy wood furniture, frosted windows, security outside the door. 3 siblings seated apart from each other, each trapped in their own thoughts, each carrying a different version of the same family history. They had been summoned there not just to hear about money. They were there to hear their father's final voice. And then the words were spoken. My son Nicholas shall receive nothing from my estate, for reasons he knows well. Just like that. No explanation. No apology. No hesitation. A single line. Sharp. Final. Irreversible. Nick didn't move. Jake stopped breathing. Romy felt the room tilt. And the man reading the will, a longtime family friend, a legendary figure in his own right, froze mid-page. Because even he hadn't expected that. Now pause for a moment. Ask yourself something. What kind of father disinherits his own son so completely and leaves behind a sentence that sounds less like legal language and more like a verdict? And what kind of secret must exist for a man to believe his son already knows exactly why? That question is where this story truly begins. Not with death, not with blood, but with silence. The kind of silence that hides years of resentment, buried warnings, and signs no one wanted to see. Because to the outside world, the Reiner family, powerful filmmaker Rob Reiner, his wife Michelle, and their children, represented success, stability, and legacy. Hollywood royalty, private premieres, holiday photos, smiles that looked effortless. But behind closed doors? That was a different story. And it's a story that would only come into focus after tragedy struck. After police lights flooded the gates of their Brentwood estate. After 2 bodies were found. After one son was taken away in handcuffs. And after a daughter whispered words to investigators that would change everything. There's someone in this family you should be looking at. Dangerous. That was the word she used. Dangerous. Let's rewind. Because to understand how a will could become a weapon, you have to understand the family it was meant for. Rob Reiner wasn't just wealthy. He was respected. Decades of influence. Awards. Power. The kind of man whose phone calls got returned instantly. The kind of man whose approval could launch careers. But at home, he was something else. Demanding. Precise. Unforgiving when disappointed. He believed in legacy more than love. Structure over softness. And his children felt that differently. Jake, the eldest, learned early how to stay in line. He mirrored his father's discipline, played by the rules, followed the expectations. He wasn't perfect, but he was predictable. Predictability earned approval. Romy, the youngest, learned how to read rooms, how to keep peace, how to observe instead of confront. She became the emotional translator of the family, smoothing over tensions before they erupted. And then there was Nick, the problem child, the unpredictable one. The son who never quite fit into the version of the future Rob Reiner had planned. From an early age, Nick pushed back, questioned authority, refused to follow the script. And when he grew older, the distance between father and son didn't close. It widened. Arguments became sharper. Absences became longer. Silence became the norm. But here's the thing no one talks about enough. Families like this don't break overnight. They fracture slowly, through unresolved conflicts, through conversations that never happen, through warnings that are ignored. And long before that will was read aloud, long before blood stained marble floors, Rob Reiner had already made his decision. That decision was written down, signed, witnessed, sealed. The will wasn't drafted in anger after a fight. It wasn't rushed. It was deliberate. Which raises another question. What happened between a father and son that made this level of disinheritance feel necessary? Because legal experts will tell you something chilling. Most parents don't completely disinherit a child unless they believe one of 2 things. Either that child is already financially secure, Or that child has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. So which was it? And why did Ron believe Nick knew well the reason? That phrase matters. It wasn't for reasons stated elsewhere. It wasn't due to estrangement. It was personal, intimate, almost accusatory. As if the will itself was meant to speak directly to Nick. As if it was Ron's final confrontation. Now imagine being in that room. Imagine being Nick. Everyone's eyes slowly turning toward you. The air thick with judgment. Questions forming but unspoken. Was this about money? Or was it about something far worse? Jake later said he felt like he was watching a dam break in slow motion. Romy said she felt sick, not because of the inheritance, but because of what it implied. And Nick? Nick said nothing. Not then. Not later. And that silence would haunt everyone. Because just days earlier, the family had already been shattered by violence. Ron and Michelle were found dead in their own home. A place that was supposed to be safe. A place with locked gates, cameras, and staff. Yet somehow, someone got close enough to kill them. Brutally. No forced entry. No robbery. Which meant one terrifying possibility. Whoever did this belonged there. Nick lived on the property. In the guest house. That fact alone would have raised eyebrows. But then came Romy's statement. Her words to police weren't dramatic. They were calm, measured, and devastating. There's a family member you should consider dangerous. She didn't say a name. But she didn't have to. Because in that moment, everything shifted. The will was no longer just a document. It became a clue. A warning from beyond the grave. A message that people would dissect word by word, looking for answers. Was Ron trying to protect his other children? Was he trying to send a signal? Or was this his final attempt to control a situation that had already spiraled out of his hands? And if Nick truly knew the reason, why didn't anyone else? Here's where things get even darker. According to people close to the family, Ron had revised his will more than once in the final years of his life. Each revision reportedly became more specific, more restrictive, more intentional, which suggests this wasn't about one incident. It was about a pattern of behavior, a pattern of concern, a pattern of fear. And that brings us to the question no one wanted to ask out loud. Was Ron Reiner afraid of his own son? Because if that's true, then the will wasn't just a legal document. It was a last line of defense. And what came next? The arrest, the charges, the public unraveling of a once private family would force everyone to confront a truth they had spent years avoiding. But before we get there, there's something you need to understand. The will wasn't read immediately after the deaths. It was delayed. And during that delay, tensions rose. Accusations whispered. Memories re-examined. Small moments from the past suddenly looked different. Arguments that once seemed trivial now felt ominous. And when the will was finally read, it didn't bring closure. It poured gasoline on an already burning fire. Because that single brutal line didn't just disinherit Nick. It isolated him, marked him, and possibly explained more than anyone was ready to admit. But the will wasn't the only document Ron left behind. And the next thing uncovered would make that one sentence feel almost merciful by comparison. Because hidden among legal files and private correspondence was something else. Something that suggested Ron knew more than anyone realized. And that discovery would change how the entire story was understood. But we're not there yet. Because first, we need to go back. Back to the early warning signs. Back to the moments when intervention was possible. Back to the night everything finally crossed the point of no return. And when we do, you'll start to see why that will said exactly what it did. And why the reason Nick knew well might be the most terrifying part of all. The first call came just after midnight. No sirens yet. No headlines. Just a phone vibrating on a polished bedside table in a house that, hours earlier, had been full of light. And when Romy answered, she already knew something was wrong. You can tell when a silence is loaded. The voice on the other end didn't rush. It didn't panic. It asked a simple question instead. Are your parents home tonight? That question should never feel like a warning. But it did. Romy sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to replay the last conversation she'd had with her mother. It had been short, casual, almost forgettable. I'll see you tomorrow, Michelle had said. Tomorrow never came. Minutes later, Romy was in her car, driving through empty streets toward the Brentwood estate she'd grown up in. She didn't call her brothers. Not yet. She told herself she was being dramatic, that this was nothing. But the closer she got, the more her hands shook. Because the gates were open. They were never open at night. Security lights burned harsh and white against the hedges. Police vehicles lined the driveway like silent accusations. Officers moved with the tense efficiency of people who already knew the worst had happened. And when Romy stepped out of her car, one of them stopped her immediately. "Ma'am, you can't go inside." That's when the world narrowed. That's when she knew. Inside the house, Ron and Michelle Reiner lay dead. Not peacefully. Not quietly. There was no sign of a break-in. No smashed windows. No forced doors. Which meant whoever did this didn't need to force their way in. They were already welcome. Already known. Already trusted. That detail would echo through every investigation that followed. Because this wasn't random. This was personal. The wounds told a story even before the detectives did. Close contact. Rage. Repetition. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something else. Something far more intimate. And as police secured the scene, another fact emerged that would immediately change the tone of the investigation. Nick was on the property. He lived there. In the guest house. Less than 100 yards away. Now pause. Ask yourself this. If something terrible happens inside a locked, guarded estate, and a family member is living steps away, how long does it take before suspicion turns inward? Not long at all. But here's the part that complicates everything. Nick wasn't hiding. He didn't flee. When officers approached the guest house, he answered the door. Calm. Too calm, some would later say. He told them he'd heard nothing. Not the screams. Not the struggle. Nothing. In a house built to carry sound. In a property designed to echo. That contradiction would become one of many. But on that first night, nothing was charged. Nothing was announced. The family was still being notified. Jake arrived next, his face pale, his suit jacket thrown on like armor. He kept asking the same question. How? No one answered him. Not yet. Because investigators were still trying to piece together a timeline that refused to make sense. Ron and Michelle had hosted a small dinner earlier that evening. Staff left around 10. Security cameras showed nothing unusual. No unknown faces. No late-night visitors. Which meant the window was narrow. And the list of possible suspects was even narrower. That's when Romy said it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet statement, delivered to an officer who was carefully taking notes. There's someone in this family you should consider dangerous. The word hung in the air. Dangerous. Not troubled. Not unstable. Dangerous. The officer looked up. Who do you mean? Romy hesitated. This wasn't something you say lightly. This wasn't something you can take back. But she didn't name anyone. She didn't have to. Because in that moment, the implication was clear. Nick. Now here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because families don't arrive at words like that overnight. You don't label someone dangerous unless there's a history behind it. Patterns. Moments. Things that make your stomach drop when you remember them. And those moments began long before that night. Long before the police tape. Long before the will. People close to the family would later describe Nick as intense. Not violent, necessarily. Just volatile. Brilliant 1 minute. Explosive the next. He carried resentment like a second spine. Toward his father especially. Ron, for his part, had grown increasingly guarded around Nick in the final years of his life. Friends noticed it. Conversations would stop when Nick entered the room. Plans changed suddenly. Locks were added. Legal paperwork was updated. And when people asked Ron if everything was okay, he'd smile and change the subject. That was Ron's way. Control the narrative. Even when it was slipping away. Back at the house, detectives began separating family members. Nick was questioned first. Routine, they said. Standard procedure. But the questions kept circling back to one thing. His relationship with his father. Nick admitted it was strained. That wasn't news. Everyone knew that. But when asked about the last time he'd spoken to Ron, Nick paused. Then gave a vague answer. Earlier in the day. No details. No emotion. That lack of specificity raised eyebrows. Especially when Romy told investigators something very different. She said there had been shouting earlier. Not playful arguing. Real shouting. Anger. She said she'd heard it through the walls when she stopped by briefly that afternoon. She hadn't stayed. She didn't want to be in the middle of it. That statement shifted everything. Because now there was conflict. Documented conflict. And conflict is motive's closest friend. Jake, meanwhile, was struggling to process any of it. He kept repeating the same thing. My brother wouldn't do this. But even as he said it, his voice cracked. Because part of him wasn't sure. That's the cruelest thing about family tragedies. They force you to confront thoughts you never wanted to have. As the night stretched on, investigators uncovered more unsettling details. Ron had been planning changes, not just to his will, to his security. He'd contacted a firm weeks earlier about upgrading systems, about limiting access, about restricting certain individuals from parts of the property. One name came up more than once in internal notes. Nick. Why would a father feel the need to protect himself from his own son? And why would he take those steps quietly? The answer might lie in something that happened months before. An incident that never made it to police reports. An argument that ended with threats. Not physical, but chilling nonetheless. According to a family acquaintance, Nick had once told his father something that stayed with him. "You'll regret this." At the time, it sounded like bitterness. In hindsight, it sounded like a warning. Back at the station, Nick's interview continued. Hours passed. His answers grew shorter, more defensive. When asked where he was during the estimated time of death, he said he was in his guest house. Alone. No witnesses. No proof. Just his word. And here's where things took a sharp turn. Forensic teams began comparing timelines. And something didn't add up. Nick's phone showed activity during a period he claimed to be asleep. Nothing dramatic. Just movement. Location pings. Small inconsistencies. But in investigations like this, small inconsistencies are everything. By morning, the house was sealed. The parents were gone. The family was broken. And the quiet estate that once symbolized power now felt like a crime scene frozen in time. News hadn't broken yet, but it would. And when it did, the public reaction would be swift and unforgiving. Because the story had all the elements people couldn't look away from. Wealth, family, violence, and a son living on the property. By the end of that day, Nick would be arrested, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The headlines would explode. But the family already knew. Before the cameras, before the commentators, before the speculation. They knew because of that word. Dangerous. And because of something else that hadn't yet been revealed. Something Rob Reiner had done quietly. Something written down. Something that would soon be read aloud. A document that would make it impossible to believe this was just coincidence. Because as investigators moved closer to the truth of what happened that night, another truth was waiting in a sealed envelope. And when that envelope was opened, it would raise a terrifying question. What if Rob Reiner had seen this coming? And what if the will wasn't about money at all, but about survival? But to understand that, we have to go back again. Back to the years when the warning signs were still whispers. Back to the fractures everyone chose to ignore. Because what came next would change everything, and no one was ready for it. Some children inherit their parents' dreams. Others inherit their disappointment. Nick Reiner inherited both, and neither ever sat comfortably on his shoulders. Here's a question worth asking right now. Are people born broken, or do they break slowly, piece by piece, inside the walls of their own home? Because if you trace Nick's story back far enough, you don't find a monster. You find a boy who never learned where he belonged. From the outside, the Reiner household looked like a success story. A powerful father, a respected mother, opportunity spilling out of every hallway, guests who spoke in admiration, doors that opened easily for the children. But privilege doesn't guarantee peace, and it certainly doesn't guarantee understanding. Nick was different early on, not in the dramatic way people later try to frame it, not violent, not cruel, just restless. Intense. He felt things deeply and expressed them poorly. Where Jake learned to adapt, Nick resisted. Where Romy observed, Nick reacted. Ron noticed this immediately, and instead of leaning in, he leaned away. Rob Reiner believed in discipline, in structure, in the idea that love was something you earned through achievement. He respected resilience, control, emotional restraint. Nick had none of that. He was emotional, volatile, curious in ways that didn't fit cleanly into expectations. As a child, he asked too many questions. As a teenager, he challenged authority. As an adult, he carried the weight of constant disapproval like a personal insult. And here's the contradiction that haunted their relationship. Ron wanted Nick to be strong. But every attempt Nick made to assert himself was interpreted as rebellion. So discipline turned into distance. Distance turned into resentment. And resentment calcified into something harder. By the time Nick reached his 20s, the relationship between father and son was less about love and more about power. Who controlled the narrative? Who set the rules? Who had the final word? Nick tried different paths to escape the shadow. He experimented with careers, moved in and out of the family orbit, tried to prove, to himself more than anyone, that he didn't need his father's approval. But here's the cruel irony. The more he tried to pull away, the more entangled he became. Financial dependence crept in slowly, not because Nick was incapable, but because Ron always positioned himself as the safety net. Alone here, a place to stay there. The guest house on the estate. It came with strings. Always strings. And Ron knew it. Friends of the family noticed how conversations between Ron and Nick would shift unpredictably. 1 minute calm, the next sharp. Ron would correct Nick publicly, subtly humiliate him under the guise of advice. Nick would bristle, bite back, sometimes storm out, and then come back. Because where else could he go? That cycle repeated itself for years. And each time, the gap widened. Here's something people often miss. Conflict isn't the most dangerous thing in a family. Silence is. And Ron mastered silence. When Nick crossed a line, real or perceived, Ron didn't explode. He withdrew. He cut off communication. He removed access. He reminded Nick, without saying a word, who held the power. That kind of punishment doesn't leave bruises. It leaves something worse. It leaves obsession. Nick became consumed with the idea that his father was deliberately undermining him. That Ron enjoyed keeping him just close enough to control, but never close enough to respect. Whether that was true or not almost stopped mattering. Because Nick believed it. And belief shapes behavior. By the time Nick moved into the guest house full-time, the relationship had reached a breaking point. Living on the same property didn't bring them closer. It intensified everything. Every interaction became charged. Every look felt like judgment. Every silence felt deliberate. Neighbors noticed raised voices. Staff learned to disappear when father and son were in the same room. And Michelle, caught between them, tried desperately to play mediator. She softened Ron's edges, explained Nick's behavior, asked for patience. But patience was running out. Ron had begun documenting things. That's a detail that wouldn't surface until later, but it matters here. He kept notes, dates, incidents, conversations. Nothing overtly criminal. Just records. Why would a father feel the need to document his own son? That question should make you uncomfortable. It made Michelle uncomfortable too. She urged Ron to let go, to stop treating Nick like a liability, to remember that this was their child. Ron listened, then continued anyway. Because in Ron's mind, preparation wasn't paranoia. It was responsibility. Nick sensed the shift. He knew his father was pulling away permanently. Opportunities dried up. Support came with harsher conditions. And eventually, Ron stopped pretending reconciliation was possible. This was when the will first changed. Quietly. No announcement. No confrontation. Just legal edits behind closed doors. Nick wasn't told. But he felt it. People often underestimate how perceptive resentment can make someone. Nick began to feel watched, judged, controlled, and that feeling fed into something darker. Anger turned inward, then outward. Friends noticed mood swings, isolation, fixation on perceived slights. And then there was the incident, the one people danced around later, the argument that went too far. According to someone who overheard it, Ron had told Nick something devastating. "You are not entitled to anything I've built." Nick didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He said something quietly, something that made Ron pause, something that stuck. "You'll regret how you're treating me." Was it a threat? Or the words of a wounded son who felt abandoned? Context matters. But context disappears when tragedy follows. After that argument, Ron escalated his precautions, security consultations, access restrictions, and eventually, the final version of the will. The one that erased Nick completely. By then, Ron believed the relationship was beyond repair. He believed Nick knew why, and maybe Nick did. But knowing doesn't mean accepting. Living in the guest house became symbolic. Close enough to watch, too far to belong. Nick was physically present but emotionally exiled. And exile breeds desperation. Here's another uncomfortable question. What happens when someone feels cut off from legacy, identity, and future, all at once? Sometimes they walk away. Sometimes they self-destruct. And sometimes they lash out. Investigators would later note how Nick's behavior changed in the weeks leading up to the murders. He was restless, agitated, fixated on conversations with his father. He asked questions about finances, about ownership, about inheritance. Ron shut those conversations down. That silence was the final insult. And then came the last day. The shouting Romy heard. The tension staff noticed. The feeling in the house that something was about to snap. No one intervened. No one forced a confrontation. Everyone assumed this was just another storm that would pass. But storms don't always pass. Sometimes they break things. And sometimes they break people. By the time night fell, the family dynamic had reached a point of no return. Whatever happened next wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of years of conflict, resentment, and unresolved fear. And yet, even now, there's a detail that refuses to settle. Because if Nick was so dangerous, if Ron was truly afraid, why didn't he remove Nick from the property entirely? Why allow him to stay? Why keep him close? That contradiction would haunt the investigation. Was Ron still holding on to hope? Or was he trying to monitor a threat he didn't know how to confront? The answer may lie in something Ron wrote privately. Something not meant for lawyers. Something not meant for the courts. Something meant as a final explanation. Because hidden among Ron's papers was more than a will. There was a message. And when that message came to light, it would change how everyone understood Nick and Ron forever. But before that message could be revealed, the legal machinery began to move. And with it came the moment that would publicly sever Nick from the family forever. The reading of the will, and the line that would turn suspicion into certainty. But what came next would expose a truth no one wanted to face. Because the will didn't just explain the past. It pointed towards something far more disturbing. Imagine this. A quiet room. Heavy curtains drawn. Afternoon light muted into a soft haze. 3 siblings sit tensely across from a man who has been the family's trusted advisor for decades. Every eye is fixed on him, every ear straining for a word, a sign, a slip. Outside, the city hums obliviously, unaware of the drama unfolding behind closed doors. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment meant to clarify, to close a chapter, to honor a legacy. Instead, it shattered everything. The man clears his throat, shuffles papers, and begins. Names, accounts, properties, philanthropic trusts, legacies carefully built over decades. The siblings listen politely. Questions are quietly noted. Tension simmers. And then he reaches the last page. A pause. A careful exhale. My son Nicholas shall receive nothing from my estate, for reasons he knows well. The room goes still. Not the polite silence of attention. Not the reflective hush of respect. The suffocating silence of disbelief. Jake's jaw tightens. Romy's hands tremble slightly, folded in her lap. And Nick? Nick doesn't flinch. At least, not outwardly. Inside, a storm is raging. The words have landed like a hammer. This wasn't just a legal decision. This was a verdict. Let's unpack why this single line is so devastating. First, the language. Nothing. Not a fraction. Not a token. Not even a gesture. Complete exclusion. The word, nothing, carries finality. It is blunt, harsh, irrevocable. Second, the justification, or the lack thereof. For reasons he knows well. A chilling phrase. It assumes guilt. It implies knowledge. It leaves the target alone to wrestle with consequences, with no mediator, no explanation, no mitigating circumstance. And finally, the timing. The reading occurs shortly after a family tragedy. Tensions are raw. Emotions frayed. Every member is fragile. The statement doesn't exist in isolation. It lands on a storm already brewing. Consider the psychological impact. For Jake, the eldest, this line signals betrayal and division. He had tried to mediate, to protect both his siblings and his parents. The declaration forces him into a new role, observer of the unraveling. He now has to reconcile his love for his brother with the explicit judgment of their father. For Romy, it triggers an internal moral dilemma. Protective by nature, she's tasked with reconciling her shock with a sense of duty. She has to navigate loyalty to a brother who is publicly condemned and a father whose final word carries absolute weight. And for Nick, it is an emotional grenade detonated in slow motion. Complete disinheritance from the parent he's spent decades struggling to satisfy, combined with the accusation of unspoken wrongdoing. It's humiliation, anger, grief, and confusion compressed into a single sentence. Now, here's the detail that most people outside the room will never see. the subtle nonverbal cues. The advisor reading the will fidgets. His voice momentarily falters. The slight tremor betrays his own disbelief. He's dealt with countless estates. He's seen difficult family dynamics. But this is extreme even for him. Romy notices this. She records it unconsciously. The human element in a document designed to be legal. The way even professionals can sense when words go beyond procedure and touch the raw, emotional core. Jake leans back, suddenly aware of the generational patterns repeating before him. Their father, in essence, has weaponized the document, turned inheritance into judgment, love into obligation, silence into a sword. Nick swallows hard. Inside, fury mixes with resignation. Does he respond? What could he possibly say? Any reaction would be read as guilt. Any defense might reinforce the judgment he has just received. He is trapped inside a trap he did not see being set. This moment isn't just about family fortune. It's about identity, about belonging, about the power of words to shape a person's entire understanding of their life. And that's what makes it irresistible for an audience. Because it's relatable at a fundamental level. Everyone has known rejection. Everyone has felt judged. Everyone has experienced the sting of being excluded. Multiply that by power, legacy, and public visibility, and you have a moment that demands attention. But what happened next? The reaction, the arguments that unfolded, the private confrontations behind the closed doors, would push everyone into uncharted territory. Jake spoke first. He tried calm reasoning. "Dad, we can discuss this." There has to be context. His voice is measured, but the tremor betrays him. Romy's eyes dart between the two men. She doesn't know where to intervene, only that something must be said. She feels the weight of secrecy pressing down. Nick's response is subtle, a nod, almost imperceptible, but it carries the weight of suppressed emotion. Anger, hurt, and disbelief swirl under the surface. And then the advisor steps in, trying to defuse the tension. He explains technicalities, legal clauses, options for appeal, and trust arrangements. But it's futile. Words can't reverse what the heart already feels. The tension in the room is so thick it could be cut with a knife. Outside, the air feels lighter, oblivious to the earthquake happening in that law office. For viewers, it's a masterclass in storytelling. Every element is present: conflict, betrayal, suspense, and human emotion at its most vulnerable. But here's where it twists further. The will is not just punitive. It is prophetic. By disinheriting Nick in such a cold, deliberate manner, Rob Reiner may have inadvertently set the stage for the next chapter of the story, one that the audience will find horrifying, fascinating, and impossible to look away from. The fallout isn't immediate. There's no dramatic screaming match, no immediate confrontation. Yet the room has shifted. Dynamics are forever altered. Every decision from this point on is framed by this one document. And as the siblings leave the office, each carrying a different piece of the emotional wreckage, the question lingers in the air. How do you rebuild trust after someone has weaponized love and legacy against you? How do you face a parent who not only judged you, but codified that judgment in legal stone? And what consequences will ripple from this moment into the lives of the siblings, the family staff, the estate, and the public perception of everything they thought they knew? One thing is certain: the story doesn't end with a signature on paper. It begins there. Because when a will is read that shocks, disinherits, and humiliates, the next moves, the next choices, the next secrets are inevitable. And those moves? They would shake the foundations of the family entirely. But what came next would escalate beyond paperwork, beyond legal disputes, into something far more personal, far more dangerous. Every family has secrets. Some are small. Some are inconvenient. Some are dangerous. And some are explosive, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy everything in their path. The Reiner family was no exception. From the outside, they were Hollywood royalty, celebrated, admired, untouchable. The media saw awards, premieres, elegant gatherings, and the occasional polished photograph of smiling children. But behind the gates of their Brentwood estate, the story was different. Much different. Nick wasn't the only one carrying pain. Jake and Romy had their own shadows, their own burdens from years of navigating a household ruled by high expectations and unspoken rules. Romy, ever observant, had learned early to read the room, predict tensions, and smooth over conflicts before they erupted. Jake, methodical and steady, had internalized the family's code, never questioned the patriarch publicly, always maintain appearances, and never, ever show weakness. But beneath that calm exterior, secrets festered. Not just about disagreements over inheritance, not just about tension with their father, but about incidents nobody dared to speak aloud. Late-night arguments that ended abruptly, misplaced documents that were quietly shredded, encounters with friends and staff that were whispered about but never clarified. And then there were the letters, long forgotten by most, but stored carefully by Ron in a private safe. Letters from colleagues, letters from old friends, some praising his career, some hinting at past betrayals, some warning him about certain family dynamics. Each letter a puzzle piece, each message a warning. Romy had once stumbled upon a portion of these letters. They were partially burned in the fireplace, seemingly destroyed, but enough survived to hint at past disputes with extended relatives and associates. She had filed them away mentally, a minor detail in her life at the time, unaware that they would become significant later. The tension between Ron and Nick had roots deeper than most outsiders could see. Early in Nick's life, he had questioned choices his father made. Not in a trivial way, questions about ethics, fairness, and honesty. These weren't disrespectful inquiries. They were challenges to a man who had built a career on carefully constructed appearances. Ron perceived these questions as threats, and from there, a dynamic developed that shaped decades of interaction. Every small rebellion by Nick was meticulously documented. Every disagreement became evidence of defiance. Over time, the private journal entries, letters, and notes compiled a narrative. Nick as the problematic child, the one who would disrupt the family legacy if left unchecked. Jake and Romy were aware, in part, but the full scope of the documentation was hidden from them. Even Michelle, deeply empathetic and loving, struggled to intervene. She tried to smooth things over, to keep communication open, but the rigidity of Ron's personality limited her influence. It's important to pause and consider something here. Families are rarely defined by a single event. They are defined by accumulations, moments, words, omissions, and decisions. One argument might seem small, inconsequential, but add 50 of them over decades, and patterns emerge. Patterns that become impossible to ignore. And in the Reiner household, the pattern was unmistakable. Nick was different, difficult, unpredictable, unacceptable by the standards his father had set. The will, then, was not created in a vacuum. It was the culmination of decades of observation, documentation, and judgment. But it wasn't the only revelation waiting to be uncovered. Because Ron, meticulous as he was, had left behind more than a legal document. He had left behind a series of journals and digital files. Some were personal reflections. Some were professional notes. Some contained candid assessments of his children. And in those assessments, Romy, Jake, and eventually Nick would find details they never expected. The files included references to events that had been kept from outsiders. Some were minor disputes. Some were deeply personal conflicts. Others hinted at choices that, if revealed, could tarnish reputations and shift public perception of the family. Romy, tasked later with organizing these materials after the tragedy, found herself piecing together an intricate puzzle. Each note hinted at motivations, fears, and grudges. Some entries suggested that Ron had anticipated conflicts escalating to a breaking point, though he never detailed exactly what that might entail. Jake, in reviewing portions of the files, realized just how calculated some of his father's decisions were. Nothing was impulsive. Every clause in the will, every safeguard in place, every restriction, all of it had been meticulously considered. Ron had left nothing to chance. And then there was Nick's file. It was more detailed than anyone could have expected. Specific incidents documented meticulously, along with Ron's thoughts and concerns. Some were professional. Nick's early business decisions, failed ventures, and financial missteps. Some were personal, behavioral patterns, emotional outbursts, and perceived threats to family harmony. But perhaps most chilling were the final notes, dated just months before Ron's death. In them, he explicitly mentions fears about Nick's behavior and the potential risks to the family's legacy. He does not elaborate fully, leaving a deliberate ambiguity, almost like a warning encoded for the future. Romy and Jake noticed this immediately. It explained, in part, the harshness of the will's language. It explained the deliberate disinheritance. And it made them wonder, did their father see the end coming? Was he aware of the growing tension that might explode? This is where a critical question arises. What do you do when a family member is labeled dangerous not by rumor or speculation, but by a lifetime of documentation? Do you intervene, confront, protect yourself? Or do you wait and hope that the worst never comes? And this is where the story becomes both compelling and terrifying. The secrets, carefully buried for decades, had set the stage for an explosive chain of events. The will was the first public revelation. The journals, files, and letters were the second. And the next revelations, when investigators began connecting these documents with the timeline of the tragic deaths, would shake the family, the community, and eventually the entire public. By now, it's clear that the Reiner family's tragedy was never a single event. It was decades in the making, shaped by ambition, fear, discipline, resentment, and secrecy. The will, harsh and final, was the spark. The secrets, long buried, were the tinder. And when they combined, the consequences became inevitable. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, it's only beginning. Because as investigators, friends, and the siblings themselves began to dig deeper, more shocking details started to emerge. Details that no one outside the family had anticipated. Details that suggested there were motives, alliances, and betrayals even more complex than the will had revealed. And one final question looms over everything. Had Ron's meticulous documentation been enough to prevent disaster, or had it merely outlined a tragedy that was already written? The night that changed everything began like any other, deceptively ordinary. The Brentwood estate was quiet. Security lights cast long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns. The gates, always carefully monitored, were closed, yet the night air carried a tension that even the staff couldn't ignore. Inside, Ron and Michelle Reiner were wrapping up a quiet evening, unaware that it would be their last. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. The city was alive with its own rhythms. The media, the neighbors, the Hollywood world beyond the walls, all oblivious. The family itself seemed normal, but beneath the polished exterior, emotions were fraying. Nick, as always, was in his guest house. It was designed to provide independence while keeping him on the property, close enough to be observed, far enough to maintain distance. That night, like many nights before, he was awake late, moving restlessly. Phone in hand, pacing, replaying conversations from earlier in the day. Words spoken, words withheld, promises broken. The tension that had built for decades reached a crescendo. Meanwhile, inside the main house, Ron and Michelle were unaware of the storm brewing so close by. They had dined early, cleared the table, and were settling into their evening routine. But small, almost imperceptible signals hinted at rising tension. A door left slightly ajar. An absent look from a staff member. A quiet exchange that seemed heavier than usual. And then, the first sounds. Not immediately identifiable. A shift in the air, the faintest creak of floorboards. Something subtle. But in a house designed with openness and security in mind, even the smallest anomaly is amplified. It's here where the narrative splits. Witnesses later would struggle to reconstruct the timeline. The official records, phone logs, and security camera footage provided fragments, pieces of a puzzle that refused to align neatly. What is known? Somewhere between evening and early night, a confrontation occurred. What kind, and with whom, remains part of the chilling ambiguity. Romy, later recounting fragments to investigators, would describe her feelings: unease, a sense that something had shifted. She visited briefly, heard raised voices, tension slicing through the walls. But she didn't stay. She assumed, like many observers in such situations, that it would pass. But some tensions don't pass. Some break through the walls, into actions that can't be undone. Investigators would later discover that the sequence of events suggested a rapid escalation. A minor disagreement, a phrase misinterpreted, a door slammed. These details, while small in isolation, multiplied to create a combustible environment. By the time anyone realized the danger, it was too late. The violence, swift and decisive, had already taken place. There were no signs of forced entry. a detail that would dominate the early speculation. Whoever carried out the act had access, familiarity, and control. The fact that Nick lived on the property added a layer of complexity. He was present, yet apparently uninvolved, or so it appeared in the initial moments. The discovery of the bodies was equally tragic and disorienting. Staff, entering for routine checks, found the scene. The immediate realization was disbelief. How could such violence occur here, in a home fortified by gates, cameras, and careful planning? Police were called, perimeter established, neighbors notified. Within minutes, investigators were combing the property, looking for clues, examining the guest house, tracing movements, reconstructing interactions. And then came Romy's statement. "There's a family member you should consider dangerous," she said quietly. The word dangerous hung in the air like smoke. Not accusatory, not emotional, but measured, clinical, almost. It carried weight because it was uttered by someone who had grown up navigating the family's intricate dynamics, someone who knew the patterns, someone who recognized escalating threats before anyone else. Nick was questioned immediately, calm, collected, deflecting, yet even his composure raised suspicion. Contradictions in timelines, small inconsistencies in phone activity, and the lingering tension in his demeanor were noted meticulously by detectives. It's critical to understand that investigations of this kind don't move in a straight line. They advance in fragments, reconciling statements with physical evidence, digital footprints, and behavioral analysis. And in the Reiner case, every piece of evidence pointed toward a collision of family dynamics and long-standing grievances. Jake, meanwhile, struggled with disbelief. He had spent years mediating, smoothing tensions, advocating for compromise. Now, faced with the tangible consequences of unresolved conflicts, he was forced to confront the reality that mediation had failed. Romy, torn between grief and the necessity to cooperate, became a crucial witness. Her calm, methodical recollections helped establish timelines, character references, and insight into family relationships. Yet even she was haunted by what she had seen, by what she had sensed but could not act upon. The evening unfolded into chaos for the family, the police, and eventually the media. Security footage was examined frame by frame. Phone records analyzed. Statements cross-checked. Every detail scrutinized. Every word considered a potential clue. And underlying it all was the ominous presence of the will. The single line disinheriting Nick was no longer just a document. It was a lens through which all behaviors, interactions, and evidence were interpreted. Public perception, initially shaped by the shocking deaths, became entwined with the revelation of familial estrangement, resentment, and secrecy. By the following morning, the property was cordoned off entirely. Forensic teams had processed initial evidence. Staff and family members were interviewed in sequence, and the world began to take notice. News outlets, social media, and Hollywood observers speculated relentlessly, but the family itself knew the truth, or at least the version they each carried in their hearts. And that truth was devastating, because this wasn't just a tragedy caused by a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of decades, unresolved conflict, meticulous documentation, psychological patterns, and choices that had been ignored, misunderstood, or suppressed. In the chaos, one question persisted. Had the tragedy been preventable? And if so, by whom? As investigators and family members wrestled with this, another layer emerged. Hidden communications, private journals, and personal reflections left by Ron suggested he had anticipated escalating tensions. But anticipation does not equal prevention. Even foresight has limits. And the audience, observing from afar, is left with a haunting realization. Wealth, status, and carefully curated appearances cannot shield anyone from the raw consequences of familial fracture. The night of tragedy marked not an end, but a beginning, the start of an unraveling narrative that would expose every secret, test loyalties, and force painful truths into the open. And as the investigation deepened, one revelation stood out. The will's brutal line, intended as a final measure of control, had inadvertently set the stage for public scrutiny, suspicion, and a re-examination of every past conflict. What had begun as a quiet, controlled environment ended in chaos, grief, and questions that might never be fully answered. But this is only the beginning. The documents, the diaries, the fragmented recollections, all pointed to a deeper web of motives, alliances, and betrayals yet to be fully uncovered. And the next chapter would begin to reveal exactly how the past, the will, and the family's darkest secrets intersected, setting the stage for a reckoning that no one saw coming. The sun rose over Brentwood the morning after the tragedy, casting a golden light on a scene forever altered. The estate, once a symbol of wealth, power, and stability, now resembled a carefully staged crime scene. Police cars, forensics vans, and flashing lights created a surreal contrast against the manicured lawns and polished gates. But outside observers could not yet grasp the depth of the storm that had just begun. Inside the estate, investigators moved methodically. Every inch of the property was examined. Every piece of evidence cataloged. Fingerprints, DNA samples, surveillance footage, nothing escaped scrutiny. Every detail, no matter how small, could illuminate what had occurred on that fateful night. Nick, living on the property, was the focal point. His presence in the guest house placed him within immediate proximity of the events. For investigators, that proximity was both convenient and troubling. It raised questions about opportunity, motive, and timing. Yet Nick's composure remained unnerving. He answered questions with a calm precision, offering only the details he deemed necessary. Every omission, every pause, was noted. Detectives trained in behavioral analysis recognized subtle cues, microexpressions, hesitation, and controlled responses, but the meaning remained ambiguous. Romy's role became increasingly critical. Her early statement about a dangerous family member was vague but deliberate. She had not named anyone, leaving investigators to piece together context from a series of conversations, historical patterns, and small but telling incidents. Meanwhile, Jake struggled to reconcile the version of his brother he knew with the one being scrutinized under a microscope. The more he considered Nick's behavior, the more contradictions emerged. Was he truly dangerous? Or was he misunderstood? And how much did decades of familial conflict color perception? Investigators began reconstructing the timeline. Security camera footage, while extensive, revealed gaps. The night's events occurred in windows too small to capture definitively. Phone records showed activity that contradicted some statements, and witnesses provided fragments of dialogue and movement that, when analyzed, suggested escalating tension in the hours leading to the tragedy. One detail stood out: there were no signs of forced entry. That implied familiarity, trust, or at least proximity. Whoever carried out the act was either welcomed, unnoticed, or already present. Each possibility carried its own implications. The will, read shortly after these discoveries, became an unexpected lens for interpretation. The declaration that Nick would inherit nothing cast a shadow over the investigation. Public perception began to coalesce around the idea of pre-existing familial conflict as a motive. Media speculation intensified, linking financial exclusion with potential resentment and anger. Romy, navigating grief and shock, began to piece together her father's intentions. Through journals, letters, and legal documents, she realized that Ron had anticipated conflict, perhaps even foreseeing that tensions might escalate to irreparable levels. Some entries suggested he feared Nick's volatility. Others revealed a meticulous tracking of patterns, behaviors, and disagreements. This insight provided context, but did not absolve anyone. Investigators noted that anticipating tension is not the same as preventing action. The family's private documentation now became an additional layer of evidence, offering both clarity and complication. Jake's focus shifted toward reconciling past interactions with present evidence. He reflected on years of trying to mediate disputes, maintain family cohesion, and balance emotional loyalty with rationality. Now, those efforts were insufficient. The patterns of conflict that had been ignored, downplayed, or rationalized were now visible in stark relief. The community, too, reacted. Neighbors shared anecdotes of previous arguments, of unusual behavior, of subtle signs of discord. Staff members, speaking quietly under assurances of confidentiality, revealed glimpses of a household strained by control, discipline, and unspoken resentments. Each account added a new layer to an already complex investigation. Yet, Amidst all this, the central question persisted. Who acted on the night of the tragedy, and why? Detectives explored every possibility. Could this have been an accident, miscalculation, or confrontation gone too far? Or was it premeditated, informed by long-standing grievances, and guided by a deep-seated sense of betrayal? Every lead intersected with the will, the family's history, and the subtle but undeniable signals of escalating tension. For Nick, the legal implications were immediate. Being present at the scene, combined with historical conflict, placed him squarely under suspicion. Every action was scrutinized. His movements, phone activity, and prior interactions with his father. The investigation was meticulous, leaving little room for oversight. Romy and Jake, meanwhile, had to contend with public perception. Media narratives were forming, social media debates intensified, and friends and colleagues began weighing in, some with speculation, others with judgment. The will, once a private document, had now become a public symbol of division and possible motive. Within the family, relationships strained further. Trust, always tenuous, fractured under the pressure of grief, investigation, and public scrutiny. Emotional alliances were tested. Sibling loyalties were questioned. The weight of expectation, judgment, and loss pressed down with unrelenting force. Through it all, one truth became clear. The investigation was not merely a legal process. It was a psychological exploration of decades of familial dynamics, patterns of behavior, and unspoken conflicts. Every detail mattered. Every nuance held potential significance. And as the investigation deepened, more revelations emerged. Private journals, letters, and notes previously considered mundane now gained significance. Patterns of concern, warnings, and anticipation became evidence of a complex, multi-layered narrative. For the audience, the lesson was stark. Wealth and status offer no immunity against the consequences of unresolved family conflict. The will, initially interpreted as a financial maneuver, had broader implications. It revealed fractures, anticipated conflict, and, unintentionally, set the stage for public and private examination of the family's most intimate dynamics. By the chapter's end, the investigation had closed in not just on physical evidence, but on emotional truth. And that truth suggested that the family's private tensions, long documented, long endured, were now inseparable from the unfolding tragedy. But even with mounting evidence, one question remained unanswered. Was this disaster a culmination of warning signs ignored, or the inevitable outcome of choices made decades ago? The answer would begin to emerge in the coming chapters, revealing shocking patterns, hidden alliances, and motives no one outside the family could have imagined. The morning after the tragedy, Jake and Romy sat in silence. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the suffocating, tense quiet that comes when the world has shifted irreversibly. The home they had known, the family they had trusted, the life they thought was stable, all had been shattered overnight. Romy replayed everything she had heard the previous evening. The voices, the tension, the arguments through walls. The warning she had given police, a family member who was dangerous. At first, she had hesitated to speak. The word dangerous felt heavy, but necessary. Now, in the aftermath, the weight of that declaration pressed down like a physical force. Jake, sitting across from her, struggled to reconcile the brother he knew with the man suspected of unimaginable violence. He had spent years acting as the mediator between Nick and their father. He had tried to smooth the edges of conflict, to reconcile tensions that seemed unresolvable. Yet now, mediation had failed spectacularly. The will, read the day before, loomed over their thoughts. The line that disinherited Nick was not just a legal statement, it was a judgment. And it forced Jake and Romy to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their father had seen the fractures in the family long before anyone else. He had taken steps to protect his legacy, his assets, and perhaps even his family. But in doing so, had he driven the wedge that made tragedy inevitable? Romy broke the silence first. Jake. He knew. He knew something was coming. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but the conviction in her words was unmistakable. She glanced at the floor, ashamed to admit how obvious it had seemed in retrospect. All the journals, all the notes, he documented everything. Jake rubbed his temples. I know. I can't believe he went this far. Nick, we never imagined it would go this far. His voice cracked, betraying the disbelief he had been holding at bay. The siblings spent the next several hours poring over documents left behind by their father. Legal files, journal entries, correspondence with business associates, notes about family behavior patterns. Everything offered a glimpse into Rob Reiner's meticulous mind. Every entry hinted at anticipation, concern, and strategic planning. He had observed Nick closely, chronicled patterns, and seemingly predicted outcomes. And yet, despite all this foresight, the tragedy had occurred. They began to piece together the timeline of conflicts, arguments, and behavioral patterns leading up to that fateful night. The shouting Romy had heard through walls, the subtle threats, the moments of tension that escalated silently over the years. All were part of a narrative that was only now becoming clear. Jake noticed a recurring pattern in the notes. Their father had not just documented behavior. He had been actively creating contingencies. Security upgrades, limited access, adjustments to the will, all designed to minimize risk. But it appeared that even meticulous planning could not contain human emotion and long-standing grievances. Romy, ever observant, pointed out something critical. He left warnings, Jake. Not explicit threats, but guidance. Instructions, almost, about what could happen if things got out of control. He knew Nick might react badly. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. And yet he left him here. The guest house. He kept him close. His voice trailed off. Why? Was it hope? Was it oversight?